Hi, Jane. Is it okay if I take over the screen now?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
And again, for those of you who are just joining, we are talking about Fintrac Compliance today, and Mihir will be guiding us through. So I'll admit everybody into the room. If you guys have any questions or comments, please drop them in the chat and we'll address them as we finish up. Thanks so much. Go ahead, Mihir.
Yes, sorry, just quickly getting set up. I just need to open this in here so that it's available. Individual and PEPs, HIOs. We have the beneficial. Yes, receipt of funds, perfect. Okay, we will go to presenter view. Okay, welcome everybody. Today I am going to be presenting on Fintrac. Zolo is rolling out Fintrac compliance throughout the brokerage, throughout Canada. This is a program that we were loosely enforcing before, but now we are, due to recent events with Fintrac coming down with heavy penalties, really going to start enforcing. Today in this Fintrac course, I'll be covering the following topics. From the basics, what is Fintrac? What are your responsibilities and obligations as a realtor? When are you required to complete a Fintrac report? Then we're going to be diving into these different reports. There's going to be the client information record, including corporation entity, the receipt of funds record, large cash, and virtual currency records. So VC is something you're going to be seeing a lot of going forward. VC refers to virtual currency, any sort of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever you've heard of recently counts as VC. Continuing with reports, there's suspicious transaction reports and terrorist property reports. There's also the ID and mandatory agreement. Diving further into Fintrac compliance, business relationships, we will be defining those and what needs to be recorded. Beneficial ownership forms, which are new for June, as of June 1st, 2021. PEPs and HIOs, this stands for politically exposed peoples or persons and head of international organizations. Record keeping requirements, so where we expect you to basically input and return these forms for storage. And then finally, the escalation of high risk clients and the ongoing support. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Mihir Sanara. I am the Zolo Realty Compliance Officer throughout Canada. Contact for all Fintrac compliance questions should be sent to this email. It's fintrac@zolo.ca. Please write this down. It will be available in places like the CRM, Workplace, and web forms for easy reference going forward. To emphasize once again, all inquiries, questions, and escalations for the Fintrac process have to be in writing and addressed to the CO at fintrac@zolo.ca. Questions sent to other emails will lead back to the Fintrac email. So if you email admin or if you email realtor support, they are going to forward those emails to Fintrac anyway, if the question is Fintrac related. Contact address will be advertised, as I mentioned, in the CRM, web forms, workplace, and intro emails to agents. So from the basics, what is Fintrac? Fintrac is the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada. Think of it like another government law enforcement branch. You can think of it like CSIS, the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service, but Fintrac has a mandate to facilitate the detection, prevention, and deterrence of money laundering and the financing of terrorist activities while ensuring the protection of personal information under its control. Real estate brokers, sales reps, and developers, when carrying out certain activities, that's real estate developers or builders, must report to Fintrac. This is a regulatory requirement for all realtors throughout Canada. Your responsibility as a realtor specifically, as a real estate agent acting on behalf of a broker, so the broker in this case will be Zolo Realty, and you would be the agent. You have an independent obligation to report suspicious transactions and terrorist property reports, or report it to your broker compliance officer. So specifically, we will go into the escalation process of how you will do your reporting for suspicious transactions further down the road. I am the compliance officer once again. If you have any questions, please email me at fintrac@zolo.ca. I'm just bringing up my slides so that I don't lose any information. Okay. So let's change the document collection process and Fintrac compliance process for the brokerage as a whole at once. Very simply, let's change the entire process to something called the KYC method. The KYC is a short form for Know Your Client. Know Your Client is an industry standard term for in finance and real estate. Through this KYC process, simultaneously as you are writing an offer for your client, complete the Fintrac forms. So ask your clients for IDs as part of the offer submission process. You say, Mr. Buyer, Mr. Seller, or Mrs. Buyer, Mrs. Seller, I understand we're ready to proceed with this transaction. My regulatory requirements require me to collect a piece of ID so that I can complete my reporting to my brokerage and to Fintrac. A script to help you explain Fintrac reporting requirements will be made available in web forms and Workplace. I am aware, as a previously active real estate agent, that clients are very sort of self-conscious about providing personal information. This includes things like IDs. So we're going to be collecting photo IDs. So they will ask you questions like, why do I have to provide this? The easiest way to explain it to them is, look, you were involved in the largest financial transaction of your life. The verification of your identity is going to be taking place multiple times throughout this transaction. And the purpose of it is to mitigate risk and crime. So verbally, this is going to be what's written in the scripts that we provide you. The scripts will be available, as I mentioned, in web forms and Workplace shortly. They will be verbal scripts as well as email scripts, because I know a lot of agents are currently working remotely. So we will provide both of those. When are you required to complete a report? There are multiple reports we're going to be discussing today. What's important for you to realize is that anytime you act in the purchase or sale of real estate, you are required to complete these reports. The further reports, the IIR is the individual identification record. The ROC is the receipt of funds record. I guess I put this C instead of the F there. Anytime you handle cash or virtual currency deposits totaling $10,000 or more, a large transaction record has to be completed by me. So if you do anticipate your client coming into the office with cash or virtual currency deposits, please escalate this to fintrac@zolo.ca. Anytime you suspect a third party is involved in a transaction, you are required to record it in the individual identification record. Anytime you act for a corporation or entity, a corporation identification record must be completed. And finally, anytime you act in a business relationship with a client, you have to record that in the IIR as well. Individual identification record is the one I was referring to. Business relationship is something I'll be defining during this course. So that explanation is forthcoming. Further, you're only required to ID a client once, even for multiple transactions. That means that you can use the same Fintrac forms from a previous transaction in a current transaction. What you are required to do, however, is for every single transaction, you are required to ask the client if they are conducting this transaction on behalf of a third party. If you suspect the client may be proceeding with this transaction or conducting the transaction on behalf of a third party, and they do not provide the information of who that third party is, that is something you still must record, and we will be discussing that a little bit further. Finally, you must respect the rules of a business relationship as established by the compliance officer. Further, more on that later. So let's dive into the first form, the individual identification record. The key points to remember is to be as descriptive as possible regarding the business or occupation of the client. Record information that clearly describes it rather than using a general term. So very specifically, if the client is a consultant, you have to give me more information as to what exactly, which field they are consulting in. The title of the client or their occupation specifically is more important than their employer. So for example, if your client works at IBM as an information technology consultant, current employer information is not required in this section, only their title at their current employment. So information technology consultant is sufficient. Agents must use one of the three methods to ID the individual. So I'm going to switch tabs here. You may be familiar with this form. If you are new to business, then this may be new to you. I'm going to make this slightly bigger. Let's go to 175. Can I do that? Yeah, this is better. This is the individual identification information record. For every purchase or sale transaction, you are required to complete this for every individual. That means if there is a husband and a wife, you will be completing one form for every single individual. The individual identification record mandatory information includes the transaction property address, your name as a sales representative or broker, date the information or credit file was consulted, and this information in Section A. Section A is full legal name of individual, address, date of birth, and nature of principal business or occupation are mandatory. If you see above here in this note, it says one of Section A.1, A.2, or A.3 must be completed. So you choose one of these sections to complete based on the information given to you from your client. So using a single piece of government issued photo ID identification and comparing it to the individual who must in most cases be present. You, for the purposes of risk assessment, we are assuming that you are meeting these people either in person or through some kind of video meeting prior to conducting the transaction on their behalf. Any photo ID issued by a Canadian government entity is valid for this section. Specifically, photo ID. We cannot use a SIM card, but a PR card is fine. We cannot use the health card, which does not have a photo on it. Okay, so photo ID is mandatory. A full list of valid IDs will be on web forums and workplace later this month. So we are trying to make this as streamlined as possible for you, and we will have a fully acceptable list of IDs. This is the section I'm referring to, A.1, Federal, Provincial, Territorial Government Issued Photo ID. In this section, you're required to record the type of identification document. You must, this is sort of during coronavirus not being enforced, but you must view the original and have a photo. By viewing the original, that could mean in person, you are physically seeing the ID, or over a video meeting, the client holds it up and you are viewing it at that time. The type of identification document has to be recorded. So driver's license, passport, PR card has to be placed in this section under 1. The document identifier number, so the number that's on the document, that could be a driver's license number, has to be recorded in full and legibly. This specific form, individual identification information record, is available on web forms, and it automatically populates for all purchase and sale transactions. My recommendation is that when, as you're collecting the photo IDs, take a photo of it, go back to your computer and enter this information on your computer, because it has to be legible. Issuing jurisdiction and country. If the issuing jurisdiction is, let's say, Canada, because it's a federal passport that you're viewing, you have to put Canada twice. Canada would go under issuing jurisdiction and country. All sections have to be completed. Document expiry date. The document must be valid and not expired. It's very important to note that, and the expiry date must be noted. Okay. There are other methods here as well. There is the credit file method, which almost no one uses because obtaining a credit file for a client is costly. It is not free. So on the credit bureau, you have to compare the ID of the client as compared to the credit bureau, and they have to match in full. If any of the information does not match, then the credit file cannot be used. For all intents and purposes, we do not recommend you use A.2 when verifying the ID, as A.1 is quite easy to do. A.3 is the dual ID process method. You must confirm two pieces of ID, independent pieces of ID, for this section to be validly completed or correctly completed. Now, these pieces of ID can be non-photo ID documents. So, for example, if the client has a bank statement, if the client has a utility bill, or if the client has a pay stub, these are all dual process ID methods that are possible, okay, to use in this section. In this case, the individual does not have to be physically present, but for the purposes of this application during coronavirus, if you are not meeting the person face-to-face, it's still acceptable to complete A.1 at this time. An exception is being made by Fintrac. Let's hop into unrepresented persons. I'm going to hop into this. So you can see A.4 is unrepresented individual reasonable measures record. An unrepresented person, as a real estate agent, you have an obligation to verify the identity of parties to a transaction that may, in some circumstances, extend beyond your own clients. The most prominent example being an unrepresented party in a mere posting for sellers. So if you're looking at placing an offer on a property listed by Purple Bricks, Property Guys, or any other mere posting real estate brokerage, you are expected to ask the seller for a piece of ID. And by they, it does refer to you as a real estate agent, are expected to take reasonable measures to verify the identity of the unrepresented party. If you are unable to verify that party's identity, the agent should indicate on the client information record that required information is unavailable and describe the measures taken to obtain the information. So to be absolutely clear, if you are the cooperating agent, if you are the buyer agent in a mere posting listing, you are required to collect information on your client, the person you are representing, the buyer. But in this example, you are also required to ask the seller for information about who they are in terms of ID and record it under the unrepresented individual record, reasonable measures record. So if the seller does not respond with an ID, reasons why measures were unsuccessful, did not provide information. If there are any other reasons, you have to explain them in full. Now, section B is the verification of third parties. It's very important for you to be able to identify third parties in a transaction. When verifying the identity of the clients, agents are required to take reasonable measures to determine if a third party is involved in the transaction. So a third party is defined by Fintrac as an individual or entity other than the individual or entity who conducts a transaction and which is providing instructions in regards to the transaction. I will give you a specific example of a third party in the next slide, but it's important for you to know if there are any third parties, they can be listed in section B.2 of the corporation entity identification information record or individual identification record. So this is a third party record. You are required to complete section B.1 by answering yes or no for every single transaction. If the answer is no, you do not have to complete the B.2. If the answer is yes, you have to attempt to complete B.2. So let's specifically discuss an example of when a third party is involved. So if an individual, A, is conducting a transaction and they have power of attorney for another individual, B, then A would be considered the client for identification purposes, and B would be the third party. Information about B would then be recorded in the verification of third parties portion of the individual identification information record. Note that Fintrac has stated that B has to have the power to give instructions to A. If B is incapacitated, then A would not be considered to be acting on behalf of a third party. So for example, if a son or daughter, so if a child has power of attorney for their parent, and the parent is, let's say, incapacitated in any way, that could include mental health issues, physical health issues, or basically anything else that would render them incapacitated, then you would be only working for the child in that transaction, and you would only have to collect the record for the child, okay? Where an agent cannot determine if there's a third party, but there are reasonable grounds to suspect that there is a third party, a record that indicates whether the client said there was a third party and that that describes why the agent suspects there is a third party must be kept. Okay. So what this specifically means is, let's say you're working with the client and the client is constantly on the phone explaining the details of the home, of the transaction to someone else on the phone, even though the transaction is being conducted solely on the behalf of the client who you are face-to-face with, then you have reasonable grounds to be suspicious that a third party is involved in this transaction. You must sort of, for every single transaction, you must ask your clients, are you conducting this transaction on behalf of a third party? That is a requirement of Fintrac as well. So regardless of if you suspect this or not, the question should be asked of if the clients are conducting this transaction on behalf of a third party. So here, once again, in section B.2 is the identification of the third party. Okay. So we discussed unrepresented individuals. The next section here is client risk. As you scroll down through the individual identification record, section C is labeled as client risk. Client risk is broken down into 3 sections: low risk, medium risk, and high risk. The designation of all of these risks is broken down into clusters. These clusters mean that clients must meet these requirements to qualify as low risk. So I'll give you an example here, which is, I would say, the majority of transactions in which the client consists of 1 or more Canadian citizens or residents, right? So permanent resident is included. Client was ID'd by the agent face-to-face. So you've met the client face-to-face, you've seen their photo ID in person, and you've taken a photo of the photo ID. The client also does not, so none of the following higher risk factors apply to the client. Okay, so the client does not, or the property is not located in a high crime area. The client has not dealt with successive transactions of the same property in a short period of time, meaning a flip may be considered a high risk transaction. Okay, client's business is cash incentive. So let's say, the best example I can give you is a convenience store. In a convenience store, the amount of people that come in and pay with cash is extremely high. So if the client is self-employed and they're specifically working in a cash-intensive business, then that may be considered a high-risk transaction. Client uses intermediate vehicles such as corporations, trusts, foundations, and partnerships, or other structures that do not seem usual for the business or seem very complex and unnecessary. For the purposes of Zolo's Fintrac policy, anytime a corporation is involved in a transaction, I would like you to escalate this to fintrac@zolo.ca. We do not expect you to be able to determine whether shell corporations, trusts, foundations, shelters of any kind are being used on a negative basis. So leave that to us, because we have the tools available at a brokerage level to verify different parts of a corporation and their uses. If a client has engaged in any activity that is consistent with a suspicious transaction, so we've discussed, I believe, suspicious transactions. No, we have not yet. We will discuss that further. If the client is an intermediary, so as we discussed, if they're working on behalf of a third party, that could be an individual. It could also be a corporation. It can also be a law office, okay? If the client is using unsupervised intermediaries, if the transaction is an assignment of a legally binding contract, so anything in red here is high risk. If the client is simply doing a purchase transaction and they are a Canadian citizen or resident and you've met them in person, then it is a low risk transaction. Okay, I'll give you another example. This is more relevant today just because of the way things are with coronavirus. Basically, everything remains the same. The client consists of a Canadian citizen or resident, but the client was ID'd by the agent using non-face-to-face methods. So Zoom, any sort of video messaging app. And also, the client does not meet any of the previous criteria here. That is still considered a low-risk transaction. I have only one definition for a medium-risk transaction. I'm setting this medium risk transaction as all of low risk plus a third party which cannot be identified qualifies as a medium risk transaction. So once again, hopping back into this, if you were completing this form, section C, it was a low risk transaction, they were a Canadian citizen or resident physically present, all you would be required to do is check mark this section or check mark this section. Only one of these should be completed, one of the check marks. The other section, there is no requirement to explain here other than in medium risk. When it does come under medium risk, an explanation is required, and all you have to mention is that the third party could not be verified. Now, high risk is one I really want to focus on. So we'll go back to the slideshow and I'll start discussing high risk. Clients consisting of one or more foreign citizen or resident. are considered high risk. Clients that were ID'd by an agent face-to-face and ID using one of the non-face-to-face techniques. So basically, if they're a foreign citizen or resident, and they were ID'd face-to-face or non-face-to-face, that's still high risk. Or specifically, the client operates or undertakes activities in a country subject to sanctions, embargoes, or similar measures, identified as a financial secrecy haven, has been identified by FATF. FATF is the Financial Action Task Force as not cooperative in the fight against money laundering, has been identified by credible sources as lacking appropriate money laundering laws and regulations. So the complete list of these countries will be included in our guidance documents on web forms and workplace, but this list is always changing. So for the most updated list, I will include a link as to where you are supposed to be checking if a country is currently sanctioned or embargoed or not. I do not expect you to check every single country. Obviously, any country within the, let's say, North Americas is compliant. Any country like India is compliant as well. Sort of, these are the highest volume transactions that we see. If you do have any specific questions about countries, please reach out to me at fintrac@zolo.ca. But for now, I do not have any further guidance beyond this in terms of high risk. If your client is a foreign citizen or resident, they are considered high risk. For high risk corporations, okay, so there is we've discussed individual identification in detail. There is another form which I don't have open. Give me 1 second. I believe it's this one. So there's a corporation entity identification information record. Now, if you're conducting the transaction on behalf of a corporation, that could be a numbered corporation, it could be a corporation with a name, and let me see if I have guidance on this available. I don't. So, yes, for the time being, any sort of corporation that is not a crown corporation or a bank, you are required to complete this for. This record will include information like, of course, just like the other form, the property address, sales broker name, your name, that's the date of the transaction, the name of the corporation, corporate address, nature of principal business, and name of directors. Now, you are required to collect articles of incorporation when you are conducting a transaction on behalf of a corporation. The majority of the time that a transaction is being conducted on behalf of a corporation, it is a commercial transaction. For commercial transactions, you are going to be collecting articles of incorporation anyway as part of your document package you're providing either to the lawyer, the seller, whatever it may be. Everyone has to do their due diligence in this. So there is very little reason for your client to not provide you articles of incorporation when they are asked for it. If this is something that does happen, in that your client says, I am conducting this transaction on behalf of a corporation, and they do not provide you articles of incorporation, that is automatically a red flag and a high-risk transaction. I do have an example of a high-risk cluster for corporations. Client is a foreign corporation or other legal entity that operates or undertakes activities in a country that is subject to sanctions, embargoes, or similar measures. Identified as a financial secrecy haven. Has been identified by the Financial Action Task Force as non-cooperative in fight against money laundering. has been identified by credible sources as lacking appropriate money laundering laws, as providing funding or support for terrorist activities, and as having significant levels of corruption or other criminal activities. So this verification of risk when it comes to client corporations, if you are not able to complete this yourself, you should immediately email fintrac@zolo.ca for further guidance. The corporation identification form is available on web forms as well, and that is the easiest place to complete this. Just like the individual identification form, you are required to ask clients if the transaction is being completed on behalf of a third party, and then assess the client risk. So Canadian corporations or foreign corporations that do not operate in high-risk countries are low risk. There is no definition of medium risk, so you will probably never be using this. And then high risk is, of course, going back to my previous slide, any corporation which meets this criteria will be a high-risk transaction. Now, when I, as a compliance officer, receive a high-risk corporate entity form or individual identification form, I am required to escalate this to Fintrac. There is an electronic reporting method that we have access to, which I have to submit these forms to. So there is a multi-level reporting process. You report to me, I report to Fintrac, just so that you're clear on that process. Okay, now this section is Section D on both individual identification and corporate entity identification records, which is business relationship. For every single transaction, purchase and sale that you complete, you have to indicate what the purpose of the business relationship is. Zolo is defining the start of a business relationship as any time you verify the ID of a client. You must complete section D.1 of the IIR, or the corporate identification, which is this one, which is you acted as an agent for the purchase or sale of either residential, commercial, residential property for income purposes or investment rental purposes, land or commercial use, or other. Other could be non-permanent residences like RVs. I haven't seen those come across the desk anytime recently, but just so that you're aware, that could be a section that could be the reason to use this section for other. Guidance on business relationships will be conveyed in detail through documents and web forms and workplace. Essentially, because of the nature of Zolo's real estate business, it's extremely difficult for us to assume that we're in a business relationship with every single client we deal with, just because there are thousands of leads daily that are assigned to agents or are making inquiries. And if we assume we're in a business relationship with every one of them, then we would have to do reports on anyone making an inquiry, and that's just not possible. So for the purposes of this, you are required to assume that a business relationship is engaged anytime you verify the ID of a client. So that would be most likely at the start of a transaction. And then you have section D.2, where you do have to complete sort of your records as well. It's good guidance from Fintrac to keep all relevant correspondences with the client on file in order to maintain a record of the information you have used to monitor the business relationship with the client. So I don't expect you to do this, but what would be ideal would be you pull all of your emails for every single transaction and you have them filed away. But what we absolutely do expect you to do as agents is use your Zolo email address for all communication with your clients, and do not do not delete any of the emails for your communication between yourself and your client. The Zolo uses Google Apps, so Google Apps Suite, Google Business Suite, whatever it's called nowadays, for all of your email addresses. And that includes unlimited storage for all of your email correspondences. Okay, so there's absolutely no reason for you to be deleting emails. Everything should be saved. Now, as of June 1st, there are 2 new forms that you need to be aware of. The beneficial ownership record, which applies when you are doing a corporate entity identification information record. So if you complete one of these, you are required to complete a beneficial ownership record. A beneficial ownership record does have some restrictions, basically. So complete subsection 1 for all entities. Complete subsection 2 for all entities. Complete subsection 3 if entity is not for-profit corporation. Confirm accuracy of information in 1, 2, and 3, and document you did this in subsection 4. If you cannot obtain information in subsections 1, 2, or confirm its accuracy, complete subsection 5. Okay, so very simply, you have to do 1 and 2, record keeping and record keeping ownership, structure, and control for every single corporation you work with. 3 only applies for charities or other not-for-profits. And then it is up to you to confirm the accuracy of the information via any of these documents. You have to check off any of the documents that you used to confirm this information. So articles of incorporation, shareholder agreement, board of directors, meeting records of decisions, yada, yada, yada. If you have completed section 3, there is a CRA list of charities that you do have to double check. And section 5 should only be completed if you cannot obtain any information for sections 1 to 2. So once again, I am expecting you to have articles of incorporation readily available if you are conducting a transaction on behalf of a corporation or entity. One thing I did not touch on, and I'm going to touch on now, is the receipt of funds record. Anytime you are involved in a purchase or sale transaction, the receipt of funds record must be completed. It's just basic information like transaction property address, sales rep, broker name, the date of the transaction, and the information on the funds. This is all very easy to do. I'm not going to go into it in detail. Yes. Yeah. So I think I emphasized that correctly, that anytime you are completing a individual identification information record or a corporate entity identification record, a receipt of funds record must be completed as well. If it is a corporation or entity, a beneficial ownership record, which is new for June 1st, 2021, must be completed. There is another document which is new for 2021. It is the PEPs and HIOs. I will be diving into this in detail, so please feel free to ask any questions for clarification, as this is new information for everyone. Agents are obligated to take reasonable measures to determine whether an individual is a politically exposed foreign person or domestic person, a head of an international organization, or a family member or close associate, of someone who falls into sections A through C. How do we expect you to procure this information? Simply ask the client. So we are using the short form here. PEP applies to politically exposed person. HIO is head of international organization. The PEP-HIO schedule for agent obligations will be available on Webform and Workplace shortly. This will be part of the larger document I'm working on, but some further detail not included in these slides. Why do we have to record PEP and HIO information? Influence and control that politically exposed persons and heads of international organizations can make them vulnerable to corruption and potential targets of criminals who could exploit their status and use them knowingly or unknowingly to carry out money laundering or terrorist activity financing offenses. The family members and close associates of PEPs and HIOs are also potential targets because they can more easily avoid detection. So we expect you to ask the client if they are a PEP or HIO. Ask them, are you a foreign dignitary? Are you a domestic dignitary? What are some titles that could be related to a PEP, either domestically or foreign? Head of state or head of government member, head of an executive council, member of legislature, deputy minister, ambassador, attaché, military officer with a rank of general or above, president of a state-owned company or state-owned bank, head of a government agency, judge of a Supreme Court, constitutional court, or court of last resort, and leader or president of a political party represented in the legislature. On a more domestic level, this could also include a member of the Senate or House of Commons, a member of legislature, deputy minister, counselor or ambassador, president of a corporation that is wholly owned directly by Her Majesty in right of Canada, head of a government agency in a province, judge of an appellate court in a province, Supreme Court of Canada, leader of presidential or political party represented in a legislature, and all the way down to a mayor. So from federal to provincial to municipal governments, anyone who holds a position of power in politics, foreign or domestic, will be a politically exposed person. In terms of a head of an international organization, it's an individual who currently has or has held within the last 5 years the specific office of head of an international organization. That could be CEO, chairman of the board, any of the C-level executives. A family member is either a spouse or a common law partner, a child, a parent, a sibling, or a spouse of a sibling. So it is a very wide definition. I do not expect you to remember all of this. It will be available in guidance through a document further this month or later this month. We did discuss receipt of funds briefly. Whenever an agent receives funds for a purchase or sale transaction, generally the buyer's agent will complete this form. So once again, recapping, this is the receipt of funds. The buyer's agent will complete this form. However, if no buyer's agent is involved, the listing agent is required to complete the receipt of funds record. If the receipt of funds record is about a corporation, you also need to keep a copy of the part of the official corporate records showing the provisions relating to the power to bind the corporation regarding the transaction, meaning that you have to record that, let's say, Mihir Sonara is an officer of the corporation for Cookies and Cream Incorporated, and he has the power to bind the corporation. You have to collect that documentation. Here's what I will tell you a little bit about in terms of large cash and large cash VC. I know there are questions in chat. There are some good questions here. I will get to these at the end of this recording. So a large cash transaction is exactly how it sounds. It's someone who places a $10,000 or more in cash as a deposit at the brokerage. We have to complete a large cash transaction for. If you're aware that your client will be placing $10,000 in cash, that could be Canadian dollars or foreign currency, you must escalate it to fintrac@zolo.ca. Now, if the client is doing something like providing multiple cash transactions to the brokerage that total $10,000 or more within a 24-hour period, then that will be considered one single transaction adding up to whatever the sum of the amounts is. But as long as it's $10,000 or more, I will have to report that to Fintrac. So contact your compliance officer, that's me, for any large cash transactions. They will be handled on a case-by-case basis. I have asked the broker of record in both BC and Ontario, and I guess Alberta, and I'm broker of record in Manitoba. We have never received cash in large amounts, but if this is something your client is doing, please escalate it to me. I think that this is becoming more and more relevant in that large virtual currency deposits towards the purchase of a property are required to be recorded as well and reported to Fintrac. There is no current form for large currency VC transactions. That's just something that is relevant to me and not to you, but it's important for you to know. So I will be collecting the information on the large cash transaction record, all of the same information as well. If you believe that you will be involved in any large virtual currency transaction, which may be becoming more and more prominent as things go forward, please escalate this to me. Guidance will be given on a case-by-case basis. There are currently no plans at Zolo to accept virtual currency, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that obstructs a client from conducting a transaction in virtual currency. They could still be able to do that through their own means. I briefly mentioned 24-hour period. How we're defining 24-hour rule is any deposit and subsequent deposits within a 24-hour period shall be considered a single deposit. 24 hours is defined as 12 o'clock a.m. to 11:59 p.m. on the same day. Now, there are situations in which in an agreement of purchase and sale, you will condition in a further deposit into a transaction. If the transaction, if the further deposit, let's say the further deposit is conditional upon the sale of a property, the client will place a further deposit of $10,000 or more. We're not concerned about that. That's not going to be a large cash transaction because most likely these are not going to be happening within a 24-hour window. These two are sort of subjective because it is up to you to detect these. Let's focus on terrorist property financing as I am reaching the end of my window here. If you suspect or have confirmation that a property will be used for the purposes of terrorism or by a recognized terrorist, you're required to immediately contact fintrac@zolo.ca. We will be providing guidance on a case-by-case basis. How you would know that potentially you're dealing with a terrorist organization or a terrorist will be, we will keep updating you on the current lists provided by the government as to who are terrorist organizations or individuals. This is another type of transaction report that I have to file, but you have to escalate these to me. It is up to you. It is your obligation to report terrorist or suspicious transactions. Now, any terrorist transaction report is a suspicious transaction report. If you have reasonable grounds to suspect a property or a transaction is related to money laundering or a terrorist activity, then that is a suspicious transaction. I'll give you a really, really sort of, I guess, prominent example of suspicious transactions is if the client openly says to you, hey, look, I just came back from the casino. I have a lot of money. I need to buy a house and I need to do it right away. That would be a suspicious transaction. Suspicious transactions may have been completed or simply attempted by the client. So even if the client says, I want to place an offer and the offer is not accepted, but they have mentioned anything that may sound suspicious, it is still a suspicious transaction. There is some caveats here that simply because a client attempts to conduct a transaction but does not complete it does not necessarily mean the transaction is suspicious. Circumstances surrounding it may contribute to suspicion. When you are escalating a suspicious transaction to me, an explanation should be included as to the complete and clear, including a complete and clear description of all factors or unusual circumstances that led to the suspicion of money laundering. Right. So if one or more transaction, you have reason to suspect one transaction for money laundering and you've done multiple transactions with the client in the past, all of those transactions will now be considered a suspicious transaction. Okay, further guidance and training. Going forward, it's important for you to know that if you haven't absorbed all of this information, it's fine. We will be basically providing you all the resources that we possibly can on Fintrac guidance in all of our, basically all the places that you do business. So the CRM, web forms, workplace, all of those will have Fintrac guidance, and all of this information will be boiled down so that you're not parsing through slideshows. Fintrac will become a mandatory course for all new agents joining Zolo and all continuing education agents. So if you're an existing agent, you will be required to complete this course at some point in the near future. We haven't determined that timeline yet, but just be aware that this is something that you are required to do. You will be required to answer some questions confirming that you've understood the guidance. So it will be sort of in a test format on Thinkific. And lastly, within Thinkific, we are embedding a e-signature in which you have to sign an attestation confirming you understand the content of the course, and that in the event of a suspicious transaction, you will escalate it to me. This is my last slide. So I'm going to stop the recording here.